Hi folks, this video is about tectonic hazards, where they form on the Earth and what types of hazards form with each other and why it is that they are forming. When we're thinking about tectonic hazards, we are thinking about volcanoes, earthquakes and tsunami. These are our tectonic hazards because they are caused by the movements of the Earth. Tectonic is all about the movements of the Earth. And the way that the Earth moves is that the very surface of the Earth is broken up into plates. Imagine an eggshell that's been shattered. These plates all sit next to each other and they join at various boundaries. These boundaries can be seen in page 3 of your textbook. What you'll also notice from the textbook is that volcanoes, earthquakes and tsunami do occur at these plate boundaries because these plates don't stay still, they move around. Look at this little diagram here where we've got the Earth, core in the centre, inner mantle and outer mantle. You'll then see above that we have the plates. In green, continental plates, and in blue, oceanic plates. Continental plates are the land that we stand on, oceanic plates sit beneath the oceans. And these plates move. They move away from each other at some points, and towards each other at other points. And this generates a variety of different plate boundaries. Where the plates come together, you have a convergent boundary, such as here. Where the plates move apart from each other, you have a divergent boundary, such as here. Sometimes the plates move past each other without pushing together or pulling apart, and this is a conservative boundary. Now these 3 plate boundaries create tectonic hazards, volcanoes, earthquakes and tsunami in different ways. Now we will be covering all of this in a bit more detail in a subsequent video, but for now I will give you the basics. If we're looking at a convergent boundary, we have our oceanic crust and our continental crust generally coming together. They are moving towards each other. Now this is caused by movements within the mantle, which we will discuss later. But the oceanic crust, which is more dense and heavier than the continental crust, because it is made of basalt, and similar rocks, and the continental crust, which is made of granite and similar rocks, is less dense, it's lighter. Now this means when 2 come together, the oceanic crust is always pushed underneath the continental crust. They get pushed together. The oceanic crust goes underneath the continental crust and gets pushed down towards the mantle of the Earth. There it heats up and it melts. This melting causes magma to rise up and form volcanoes. Now because it's risen up a long way from where it was generated, this is the melting of the rock. Because it's been pushed together, it's creating a huge amount of friction, huge amount of heat. It's melted down here, but it's lost temperature as it's got higher, and it's picked up impurities as it's gone through. It's picked up more rock, so it becomes thicker. So you get these cone-shaped volcanoes because the lava, when it comes out of the ground, it's magma while it's in the ground. Lava, when it comes out, is very thick and it's quite cool. So you get volcanoes, which pop up a little bit into the continental plate because of the melting. Now that pressure that's caused the rocks to melt builds up and is released in jerks as the plates move downwards. And this causes earthquakes to form at the same points where the pressure is being released from the plates. Get an earthquake forming, and that sends shock waves up through the earth so it can be felt on the surface. So we get volcanoes and we get earthquakes. Those earthquakes can also be enough to push a huge body of water and create a tsunami. So you find that at convergent boundaries we have volcanoes, and they're often quite steep-sided. We have earthquakes, which are often quite deep and quite violent. And we can have tsunami as a result of the earthquakes. Now the divergent boundary, what we find is that we've got the plates pulling apart from each other. In this case, two oceanic plates, both made of basalt or basaltic rock, and they're pulling apart, which is leaving this gap here. And that gap allows magma to rise up. So magma rises up. Now it's not got to push its way through anything. Unlike the magma here, it doesn't have to rise up through a load of rock which will cool it off and through which it'll pick up impurities. Instead it's just coming straight to the surface, which means it's much hotter and it's also much less viscous, much runnier. So you do get volcanoes, but because the magma is viscous and hot, it'll flow much further, and so you get these sort of shield-shaped volcanoes, as they're known. Much more sloping sides because the magma can travel further. However, there's no pressure being built up, whereas here there's pressure between the two plates pushing past each other. There's no pressure being built up here. So in terms of earthquakes, we don't really get earthquakes. We get some earth tremors, so you get some little ones. But nothing substantial. So the plates might shake a little bit, but you won't get any proper earthquakes. As for tsunami, well, there's no earthquakes to cause them. So generally, you don't tend to get tsunami at divergent plate boundaries. So finally, what about conservative boundaries? At conservative boundaries, the plates are just pushing past each other. There's pressure that gets released eventually, but because a plate isn't being pushed under and there's no gap being opened up for magma to flow through, you don't get volcanoes, or at least not in any huge number. You might get a few small ones. But they are minor, they're very, very small, and it tends to just be gas. What you do get though, because of this pressure, which is building up underneath the surface, is you get earthquakes. And these earthquakes, because they're very shallow, very close to the surface, cause a lot of damage. They're very violent compared to deeper earthquakes. Deeper earthquakes often have more power, but they cause less shaking. And that's something we'll consider later on in the course. So you get shallow, very violent shaking. As opposed to deep, violent but quite shuddering, these are intense shaking. Tsunami don't tend to happen. So, to summarise, as a convergent boundary, you will get steep-sided volcanoes, deep, quite violent earthquakes and tsunami. At a divergent boundary, you will get shallow, shield-shaped volcanoes, maybe some tremors, but no real earthquakes and no tsunami. At a conservative boundary, you'll get maybe a few small volcanoes, but definitely shallow, really shaking, violent earthquakes. Don't tend to get tsunami. And that's how the plate boundaries link in to tectonic hazards for about 95% of the cases. A type of boundary that we haven't looked at is a convergent boundary where two continental crusts come together. We call these collision boundaries because, what with them being the same density, one can't go over the top of the other. So one can't subduct or go underneath the other one. As the plates move and push these pieces of crust together, they push into each other and they buckle up like cars would if they crash into each other. And it creates folding. And this folding leads to what are known as fold mountains being formed, like the Himalayas. So they push together and they crumple up. This can cause some earthquakes because of the shifting and breaking of the plates, but you don't get volcanoes here because there's no subduction. Sub meaning below, duct meaning lead, so the leading under. Nothing's being led under, they're just crushing into each other, so you just get earthquakes. There are two exceptions to the plate boundary idea of locating tectonic hazards, i.e. that tectonic hazards happen on plate boundaries. The two exceptions are hotspots and intra-plate earthquakes. These do not occur at plate boundaries, whereas all the other hazards do. At hotspots you get volcanoes, and at intraplate points you get earthquakes. Now, intra-plate means within a plate. So it's not between plates, it's within them. If we look at hotspots, what's happening here is that rather than it being plates moving around because of movements of magma within the mantle, the plate is already moving along and it happens to pass over a mantle plume, sorry, a magma plume in the mantle. And a plume is where, for reasons that we don't really understand, the magma happens to rise up at a random point. There are predictable points where magma rises up, but we're going to cover that in the next video. The magma rises up in a plume and it cuts through the crust and creates volcanoes. So here we go. This plume of magma has risen up from the mantle, cut through the crust, and it creates a volcano. And much like in Hawaii, the islands of Hawaii are created in this way. But what happens is the plate moves is that the volcano stays put on the plate, but the plume stays put in the magma. So as the plate moves away, the volcano moves with it. So if you imagine there's a previous volcano which built up here, but it's moved away because the plate's moving in this direction, it's moved away from the plume. So the plume creates a new volcano, and when the plate moves on a bit further, a new volcano will form about here. And this is how you get island chains, like Hawaii, for example. And they occur because a plate moves across and the plume keeps coming up and creating new volcanoes. As for intraplate earthquakes, the plates themselves, as they move across the crust of the Earth, they don't necessarily move smoothly. They might crack and bend and shift as they are moving across the Earth's surface. And if there's a weak point in the plate, for example, if the crust is just a little thinner, as it's moving, it might actually develop a couple of little cracks. It might fracture, much like if you bend a piece of wood just a little bit too far. So it might crack, and that cracking will release an earthquake. Now these are very uncommon and they're not really very well understood, but sometimes, for example, when we get earthquakes in the UK, they can be intraplate earthquakes because of the shifting of a tectonic plate. So these are not caused by plate boundaries, but they are caused by tectonic movement. So to summarise, we've looked at convergent, divergent and conservative boundaries. At convergent boundaries, we found that there were volcanoes, earthquakes and tsunamis possible. At a divergent boundary, you can get volcanoes, you might get tremors, but unlikely to get earthquakes, and you probably won't get tsunamis. And at a conservative boundary, you'll get earthquakes, you might get a tsunami, and you might get some volcanoes, but they're very unlikely. And those are all tectonic hazards. However, you can get intraplate earthquakes, the earthquake being the hazard, and volcanoes at hotspots as well. If you look at page 3 in your textbook, you can see whereabouts in the world those are. Now we're going to think a bit more about why the plates move, where the magma comes from, and how heat within the mantle is responsible for all of this in a further video. But if you have any questions about this video, please ask. Thanks for watching.